The Bush lineage has blood ties to a great number of former presidents: George Washington, Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses Grant, Rutherford Hayes, James Garfield, Grover Cleveland, Teddy Roosevelt, William Taft, Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, Franklin Roosevelt, Richard Nixon, and Gerald Ford. Michael Tessarion points out in his work that Bush is closely related to every European monarch on and off the throne, and has kinship with every member of Britain's royal family. Bush's family tree can be documented as far back as the early 15th century. He has a direct descent from Henry III and from Henry VIII's sister Mary Tudor. He is also descended from Charles II of England. And we also find that George W. Bush is a direct descendant of Godfrey de Bouillon. Godfrey was the first king of Jerusalem after he recaptured it from the Saracens, which was the name for the Islamic faith during the Middle Ages. It is interesting to note that the current occupation of the United States in the Middle East was re-established by the same family, George Bush Sr. in 1991, and again by George Bush Jr. in 2003. George Bush Jr. is then found to be a cousin to both opposing candidates of his 2 terms in office, Al Gore and John Kerry. Democratic President Barack Obama also has blood ties with George W. Bush, as well as Gerald Ford, Lyndon Johnson, Harry Truman, James Madison, and the British Prime Minister Sir Winston Churchill. On the opposing side of the 2008 presidential ballot, John McCain is descended from Robert the Bruce, King William I of Scotland, and also Godfrey de Bouillon. These blood ties go on and are documented thoroughly through literature such as Burke's Peerage and other comparable books. The point of all of this is that we find not just the same people, but the same intent within the people who have held high positions of monarchy, dynasty, aristocracy, and democracy in the past and present, and they are all related by a physical and symbolic link. This bloodline carries the symbol of our illness.
And it's in this area of the world, what is now Turkey, up to the Caucasus Mountains, and what is now Iraq particularly. Iraq was the home of the very advanced culture, going back to 4000 BC down to around 2000 BC, of Sumer. In the same area that we call Iraq today is Babylon. And interestingly, it was the text and accounts and records of that very area, of those cultures, that were destroyed, and many priceless artifacts from that time looted, according to the museum directors, by experts who knew what they were looking for, when all the chaos broke as a result of the invasion of Iraq. And in this area, certain family lines that were considered to be royal lines and claimed to have the right to rule the people because of their bloodline, what we call the royal families, started to appear. And as you move through history, these families exported themselves out into Europe, where they became the aristocracy of Europe and the royal families of Europe, royal family of Europe in truth, and then through what we call the Great British Empire and other European empires, but particularly the British and particularly the French together, these royal bloodlines were exported all over the world, to North America, to Australia, and elsewhere. And they are the ones today that turn up in the positions of ruling power in politics and banking and what have you. Babylon was an ancient headquarters of this Illuminati. Like I said, and that's why, as we'll get to as we go through, these Illuminati today use a tremendous amount of Babylonian symbolism in their own codes and language. This is the area I'm talking about. Egypt came into it as well, but this area was crucial to this point where we pick the story up. And this, of course, is the very area that these guys are now going back in with a list of countries to take over in the same area of the world. So you had these royal bloodlines that moved up into Europe and became the aristocracy and royal families of Europe, etc. And a lot of researchers are now starting to look at this, because it was very clear to me when I started to investigate this that for some reason these Illuminati families are obsessed with interbreeding with each other. And this has been put together from a number of different genealogical sources: Burke's Peerage, the Boston Historical Genealogical Society that looks at the genealogy of presidents of the United States. And you find that you can pick up certain lines in that ancient part of the world that I'm talking about and come down right the way through to the present day. Philip of Macedonia, who was the father of Alexander the Great, that before he died in Babylon around the age of 32, 33, had taken over much of that blue and white map we saw a few seconds ago. Comes down through the royal lines of Egypt and the Roman Empire, down through Herod, the king mentioned in the Bible stories. Also comes down through Constantine the Great, who was the Roman emperor who in 325 AD called the Council of Nicaea that created the structure that still is Christianity to this day. And it comes down through the Merovingians. Now the Merovingians kind of disappeared from history and then came to light more recently in the last, 20 years or so, through books like Holy Blood, Holy Grail, that investigated what was claimed to be the bloodline of Jesus. I think there's another interpretation of that myself, that included the Merovingians in what we now call France. The Merovingians were a royal line of a group of people called the Sicambrian Franks, who became known as the Franks, and that's where France comes from. And the Merovingians are a royal bloodline that were big goddess Diana worshippers. And they were very much based in what we now call France and Paris. And the royal families of Europe are all connected into the Merovingian bloodline. Also, the vast overwhelming majority of American presidents from George Washington to George W. Bush connect into that same bloodline. In fact, another one on this list, Charlemagne, one of the most famous monarchs of what we now call France, that went on from the Merovingians. Of the 43 presidents of the United States, from Washington to Bush, 34 go back to Charlemagne. The Habsburgs, that were the family that ruled the Holy Roman Empire in Europe for centuries, connect into this same bloodline. And the de' Medici family, big bloodline in Italy, banking family, and the House of Lorraine in France, up to this day an important bloodline in the Illuminati. And interestingly, a couple of very famous people were connected to both the de' Medici family and the House of Lorraine. One was called Christopher Columbus, who was connected to both. Christopher Columbus was not looking for India and tripped over the Americas. He knew pretty much where he was going because of the knowledge held outside the public arena. And another guy who worked for both families we know as Nostradamus, Michel de Notre Dame. The reason that guy, I'm not saying he was a bad guy or anything, but the reason he had tremendous esoteric knowledge compared with the rest of the population is because he had access into these advanced levels of knowledge that are passed over through this secret society network through history and kept from the people.